Hi, this is Lex, and welcome to the FinTech Blueprint. It's your podcast about fintech, decentralized finance, digital banking, investing, robo-advice, artificial intelligence, and all the other frontier technology that is transforming financial services. To get more content, like an illustrated transcript of this conversation in your inbox, subscribe at fintechblueprint.com. So without further delay, let's jump into today's episode. Hi, everybody, and welcome to today's conversation. I'm really excited today to welcome Mark Aubrey, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Catheon Gaming, a really fascinating blockchain-based gaming and entertainment company. We're going to talk about the evolution of the gaming sector and especially the evolution of the Web3 gaming sector, but we'll also learn a ton about the more traditional entertainment industry and how to think about virtual worlds and how to think about communities. With that, Mark, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Lex. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. I've been really looking forward to this conversation because there's so much I'm excited to learn. Let's start at the beginning of your professional journey and the foundational experiences that you've had in the beginning of your career that kind of formed how you think. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, look, I was always quite, drawn to sort of strong analytics and strong commercial kind of backgrounds. And I think when I first entered the video games business about, 20 years ago, it was still relatively nascent at that point. It was growing, but it looked nothing like the kind of, behemoth that you see now where video games is, pretty much bigger than all other forms of entertainment combined. But, I could see the strong growth and the strong potential that gaming had. So, I had a marketing background. I was very keen. I didn't at the time even really know roles existed in the video games industry, but I was lucky enough to get a role with Activision and managed multiple of their key franchises on PC and console that led to carving out a career, over the next 20 years, from marketing with Activision, working on LucasArts. I was working on Star Wars and the Indiana Jones games, which was unbelievable. And then was one of Warner Brothers' very early video games employees, in about 2008 when they decided to enter the video game space. They made some really big investments into that. And I was one of their first international employees that helped sort of build and craft out that strategy for Warner Brothers Games division. I took a bit of a pivot and spent a couple of years in casino gaming, which was the same but slightly different, and then the last 7.5 years I've been at Activision Blizzard running Activision Publishing and Blizzard Entertainment's, go-to-market and commercial operations, thinking about communities of players, across the region. I oversaw the Asia Pacific organization. So all of our teams across Asia, huge communities of players across some of the biggest franchises in entertainment and in video games. And so through that, it was a huge learning experience for me, both as a marketeer and later as a sort of more general manager, managing director. And, I think now looking towards Web3 and blockchain gaming and this exciting new world, I was really excited to take on this challenge, as I really think this is a massive evolution or the next major evolution for the video game space.
That's fascinating stuff. I want to start us really, really narrow and then kind of build up to the portfolio or the global level, sort of similar to the trajectory of your career. I want to start with just a very naive question to get our definitions, which is, in your view, what is a video game? And when you were just joining the industry for the first time, you were excited about it. In your mind, can you describe what is a video game? What is the purpose of it? Who is it for? How is it made?
Yeah, I think if I could put that into its most narrow form, it's of course entertainment. So it has to be fun. But I believe probably the interactive nature of video games, probably the word that comes to mind for me is escapism. And so it's the ability to, through entertainment medium, escape into a new world. And whether that's a fantasy-oriented world, or whether it's the cockpit of a F1 fighter or a Formula One racing car, or it's putting you on the pitch at Wembley playing for the FA Cup in a soccer game. That in its essence is what gaming in its purest form. And when I first entered the industry, it was more single player oriented. But I think in its purest form, that's what it was. And then it evolved into something way bigger. And that became more community oriented and social oriented. So it has come on massively since then. But I think in its purest form, escapism and entertainment is what comes to mind for me.
I'm tempted to kind of double click on just what those words mean, and what does it mean for somebody to escape or to be entertained? What's the difference between escaping into a virtual experience versus into a physical experience, and kind of like the distinction between those? I'm worried that's almost too abstract. In my mind, I'm connecting that to the idea of like a game designer, like of somebody designing that experience. Is that a distinction that's useful?
I think it is. And look, and I don't think it's massively dissimilar to other forms of entertainment. If you think about, the escapism for a couple of hours that you get when you sit down and watch a film, I think it's much more complex in many regards. No disrespect to any other mediums, but I think when a game designer sits down to develop the game, they really need to be thinking about the interactive, nature of that environment. And, having spent years working with studios and animators and game designers and developers, what they do is extraordinary. The worlds they build and the art that they create, and it really is art, is true escapism, from the character development to the storytelling but they have to do it in a way that puts the player center to the storyline, center to the experience. And it's incredible. I worked more, on the publishing side of the business, and I was constantly in awe of the incredible art that game designers and game developers create in developing these worlds and thinking about story arcs and thinking about interactivity and battles, and how they really immerse players in that experience in a single player campaign, but even more extraordinarily when you think about multiple human players in that environment. And it's incredible.
It definitely is. And I think that the evolution of the genre has been really interesting, because maybe 40 years ago, you could sort of lob this criticism of video games being toys because they couldn't render very much, or because they were transparent in the way that they worked, or because they were for points. It was very much sort of a childhood bracket around it. But as the generations that had that as part of their childhood became economically productive and mature and so on, it feels to me that the genre has turned into like simulations or renderings of narrative experience. And so I think that people can have much more real, much more profound experiences within these virtual environments and within the rule sets of these virtual environments that make them feel, more fulfilled or actualized, like reaching their potential in a way. And those feelings are more real than many that they encounter in the physical world. I mean, have you seen a similar type of trajectory, or am I projecting?
No, I think you're 100% spot on. I think the sense of achievement, the sense of, complex problem solving that you achieve, you're in this virtual world, or you're in this environment that, is for all intended purposes, it's entertaining and that it's fun. But you are, you're being challenged in multiple different ways. You're being asked to think about things differently, and the sense of achievement, the emotional attachment, that you get to the characters elicits, all sorts of emotions. And I think that is the beauty of video games. And it's been incredible, over 20 years to see how much they've evolved. I mean, it was a constant battle, very early on in the industry. It was very much seen as though it was kids play, yet, internally in the industry, we knew the average age of a gamer was actually over 30. Now it's more like over 40, and it's gender neutral. It's equally male, equally female. And, some of the games that get created, the biggest audiences are females 40, 45, 50 plus. So it's incredible to see how the whole ecosystem has evolved. But, I think those experiences, as you say, are richer for the fact that, you're creating emotional attachments, you're solving complex problems, you're working through, you have to work hard to achieve the outcome at the end of that. And I think that's an incredibly rewarding experience for the person going through it.
Let's talk about the business of publishing and your role of running a portfolio of various titles. Can you flesh that out a bit? Like, what was that like? And how did you think about maybe the economics of it or what it meant to grow it? Like from a business perspective, what was your experience?
Over the years, it changed a lot as video games changed, because, in the early days, it was all about how many boxes you sold, right? You would release a game, it would sell for $60 US, equivalent all over the world. And you measured success based on how many boxes went out the door. And, our job was to, market and publish and build sort of go-to-market plans that would, create hype and buzz and excitement for those games. Over time, the model shifted, and that shifted with the growth of mobile gaming, the growth of free-to-play gaming, and the growth of massive online communities. And it almost got to the point, particularly for really big publishers, it almost got to the point where you were less competing with other titles and more, you were looking internally at your own ecosystem, your own community of players. And you were thinking, the commercial model, or the success of that commercial model was built based on, the number of players you had and could, retain in your ecosystem. So, you would have, the role was then more around new user acquisition and retention and win back and limiting churn. And what was interesting about that was, that you had to do that by creating really strong, compelling gameplay, but doing that on an ongoing basis. So that's where the whole concept of live operations or ongoing content within the gaming sort of ecosystem, meant that games became 24/7, 365 days a year. And, the game, if you did launch a premium game at all, just became the start of the process of something that really became what became termed, the term was games as a service. And you were managing that game as an ongoing live service to a community of players that you did your best to keep entertained and engaged in your product. Otherwise, they moved on to something else. It's challenging and it's competitive, but the big games that do it well, it's incredibly rewarding. But I think that's, and we will get onto it, I think that's when you start to look towards Web3 and blockchain gaming. I think that's where it gets interesting, because if I look at the dark side of that, the growth of free-to-play and the growth of mobile gaming has, in some regards created models that, were always about, okay, well, how do we continue to monetize this audience? How do we continue to build revenue, which you need to do. You're spending a fortune on developing and developing these games, but it also led to a monetization loop that needed to be attached to that. So yeah, launching a video game today and keeping it ongoing in a live environment it's a very challenging thing to do, particularly for a successful game.
Yeah, and I think, just to wrap additional context around that this transition happened in the gaming industry, but it also happened in the software industry more broadly, right? So if you look at selling copies of Windows and Microsoft Office to instead getting people into an ongoing subscription for $10 a month to, storage and Office, and you look at the same with Photoshop and so on. So software got repackaged that way, and actually a lot of business got repackaged that way. Startups are built on cumulative recurring revenue as part of a venture capital funding model. And the whole world went to subscription and shifted into something that is incentivized to get people to continue paying and kind of be in this addictive stream of engagement. Can you share any of the kind of the scale of these more popular games that you had covered either in the earlier days or in the last few years when you were managing at a very senior level? Can you talk about sort of the size of some of these communities and then how you think about individual consumers?
Some of these communities they're in the tens of millions of players. And, and the way that you would serve that community, I think, I can't remember the exact number, but at the time I left Activision Blizzard, I believe across their portfolio they had something like 400 million monthly average users there or thereabouts across their portfolio of games. So it's an enormous audience of players, and depending on what game they were in, whether it was Call of Duty or World of Warcraft or Overwatch or Candy Crush or whatever, you had very different tactics and very different approaches to those audiences. But you're dealing with, and that's just within Activision Blizzard's portfolio. If I look to Roblox, if I look to Fortnite, if I look to League of Legends, you're dealing with audiences that are in the tens, if not hundreds of millions of players worldwide. These are enormous audiences, huge.
Within the industry, what is a good metric for a paying customer per year? Like, what is an expected benchmark for monetization of this type of audience?
It is very, very different by game. So, I mean, the metric would be something like average revenue per user or average revenue per paying user would be, but even you might look at monthly average users, depending on the game, there's multiple metrics that you could look that would gauge the success of that game. And it differs wildly. There isn't a single kind of metric by genre or by game, but there's multiple metrics within live game environments that game companies would look at on a regular basis to measure the success and health of their product.
I bring this up because, we talk about and think about financial services quite a bit with our audience, and there's always this refrain about getting access to financial services, getting access to some particular product that enables you to, if you have access to lending, for example, you're able to buy something that you need or build something that you need. There's been this trend of similarly creating these subscription flows that get people kind of plugged in and engaged into various ecosystems with capital in them. And to me, like, the entertainment experience has gotten around to a really similar place, which is why we'll get into, Catheon and blockchain and metaverse stuff. It's gotten to a similar place, into a similar shape, which is these aren't games in the sense that you are, you want to put a quarter into a machine and make a ball go around. You're paying like access to a particular emotional state and maybe even set of social connections, and you are often doing kind of almost productive activity there, right? Like World of Warcraft has an economy. World of Warcraft has economic output, or at least some sort of macroeconomics. How do you think about the economics within traditional games, like the gold farming that would go on and, like item exchanges and stuff like that?
Yeah, they're particularly for a game like a massive multiplayer role-playing game, they're incredibly complex in-game economies. You will have a in-game economist that basically will be responsible for building out that economy and assuring how it works and that it's all balanced and everything within it. No differently to the way it would be built out in real world economy. So I mean they're incredibly complex, and they have enabled people outside the game ecosystem. With WoW, that you mentioned, you have people that were having people farm gold for them in Vietnam or in another sort of world to sort of take that grind out and then sell that outside of the game ecosystem. So yeah, it's an incredibly complex environment, and the more games have become service oriented, that in-game economy or an in-game currency that sits within game has become pretty much the norm across all genres, all sorts of games.
If we move towards Web3 and blockchain, right, you've established a pretty prolific career in some of the best brands in the entertainment world. And yet here you are a few months ago, you've joined Catheon Gaming as the CEO. Can you tell us about, first, just your experience of observing and thinking about Web3 before you pulled the trigger, and kind of what kinds of symptoms and evidence that you were noticing that led you towards this industry and pulled you in?
I think there was a couple of things for me, and the first ones were actually broader than gaming, but then ended up being tied to tied to gaming, and that was just the whole idea of a more decentralized internet, and the game changing sort of shift that Web3 will create to our lives holistically, is enormous. And watching sort of the growth of decentralized finance and a lot of the different crypto apps and wallets and transactions that were happening in that space, and it was evolving so quickly. And and then you tie in elements of the metaverse and what that would look like, and this concept of virtual worlds that exist in this environment. And then I started to sort of see the early games that were coming into this space. And, with a lot of technology, gaming has quite often been the Trojan horse of mass adoption of a shift in technology. And when I saw a lot of the very early games, you could see that they weren't going to be what the future of this looked like. There were probably more DeFi-oriented games that had some level of gamification that sat at the back of them. So the kind of earn mechanics or the DeFi mechanics sat up front, and then there was sort of some element of game behind that. But I could sort of start to see, particularly, with the types of products that I worked on with these huge engaged communities, you could see a world whereby when the entertainment value started to come more to the fore and the earn mechanics started to become more secondary benefits of what was already a very fun and engaging experience, you then understood the benefits of smart contracts enabled by the blockchain underneath that and what that could unlock. I could see a world where this was just going to be absolutely game changing within the video games business. And why I believe that is that, game communities are now the absolute lifeblood of a successful game. There is no game without a successful, thriving community of players. And not only do those communities of players spend hours of their own time and put loads of their own money into those experiences, but video game companies use those communities to even actively market the game. You'll use influencers, you'll use ambassadors from the community, you'll run tournaments, you will use professional athletes that play the game in esports ecosystem. So the communities aren't just the lifeblood, they're now an active part of what makes a AAA game successful and give it longevity. So this concept of creating a more circular economy that in some way creates utility or reward for the community, that recognizes the role that they play within that ecosystem, either as a player of the game or whether that's through user-generated content or through another means of how they contribute to that ecosystem, that's game-changing in the video games industry. And when so that I guess a long-winded way of saying, they were the things where if I look at that and I look at that done well and I look at the evolution of this space, I just think it's bound to be a huge evolution of the game space. And that's essentially what brought me into it.
It's a very eloquent framing of all the things that are pushing Web3 forward. And I have a question around it, which is, if you look at some historic analogies, when Napster came out, the traditional music labels hated it. And, Metallica famously tried to sue a bunch of teenagers for pirating their music. With Bitcoin and crypto going online and being available, as early as 2009 and then really exploding in usage through the 2010s, the financial industry did as much as possible to not acknowledge or recognize or be interested in any of the profound transformations underneath the branding and the packaging of what they thought crypto was. Now that blockchain-based gaming and the NFT sort of wave is hitting the entertainment industry pretty profoundly, there's similar pushback, similar in the sense of people that are used to how stuff is and that like how stuff is really don't want to consider another model and are often really allergic to it. And it's been very surprising to me because a large portion of the gamer community people who love these virtual experiences, who maybe have not been crypto native and have not needed to deal with it in their life or even think about it, have really struggled to accept or invite in the fact that you can have Web3 features and that they could enhance their experience and create new opportunities and kind of supercharge user-generated content and creativity. Why do you think there's this tension by, gamers who want blockchain and NFTs and then gamers who think that it should be kept out of their experience?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I think the analogies you drew are perfect. Because if your business model is predicated on selling CDs that have got 13 tracks on them, from Metallica, and Spotify comes out and says, hey, just stream this music for free, it fundamentally disrupts the business model. And you're seeing the same thing here. So I'll answer the question in two sides. I think from a core publisher side, if I think publishers are watching the space, but when you 100% control the in-game economies and the whole flow of revenue from the business is one way, there's no immediate desire from a publishing perspective or a development perspective to go, hey, yeah, look, let's go and share elements of our ecosystem and share this with communities of players and provide some level of utility back. So it's natural there that there's going to be a bit of a wait and see approach. I think on the player side, a lot of education is required to the benefit, but I don't blame player communities because if we're being honest, they've been burned. Modern free to play mechanics that sit in the game, kind of, you join, you play, you come into a game for free. You play the game, you're consistently being provided with new content. That new content consistently requires you to spend more money in the game. And, you eventually get to a point in a lot of these games where more often than not, they're pay to win. You're either going to have to invest loads of time to get through, or you're going to have to, and development teams need to get paid. So, gamers have become very skeptical. So I think, at the start of then saying, hey, here's these NFTs, here's these digital assets or these things that you can buy in the game, I think it's a very natural reaction for gamers to just say, hey, this is just another way to monetize us, and it's another way to kind of pull money out of the pockets. And that's led to skepticism, and the video games companies have certainly got no reason to say, oh, no, this is actually a good thing. I think once you start understanding the benefits and once you start talking about the ability to have true ownership, thinking about interoperability, and the way that could exist inside some games, even outside, blurring the lines between physical and real world. And if you think about the true ability to own an asset that you can buy, sell, and trade in games. So if you don't want to play a game anymore, you get something back for the contribution and the hours and the money that you've put into the game by trading those assets. And then when you think about the whole world of user-generated content, some of the biggest games in the world have been built out of modifications to games. So if you think about potentially open source ecosystems that allow user-generated content, and if that user-generated content becomes successful, then the community that developed it, or the player that developed it, and the developer, they both benefit from that. And via the smart contract can both share in that success. From a developer, you could even think of alternate ways to source funding for a game. I mean, there's multiple benefits, but as it stands today, and I think some of this is tied to what the very early product looks like, which is still very earn forward and not entertainment forward. The true benefits of what this could look like and how it could evolve aren't necessarily that well understood yet. But over time, I believe they will be, and that will lead to a greater acceptance of what blockchain gaming offers, just like all the examples that you provided when people better understood those business models as well.
It's a very profound fundamental transformation at the level of tools available for creatives, whether they are commercially minded or whether they are, just artistically minded. And it's just a matter of those tools going through iterations and iterations until people realize how much more interesting or engaging or better their experience could be from these games. Which takes me to Catheon. And I know we've taken a windy road here, which I appreciate because I think we've opened up a lot of important and interesting stuff. Let's talk about Catheon and let's talk about, its portfolio and position, right? So there's over 20 games that have been built, including on Solana. There's millions of community members. There's lots and lots of downloads across all the different games that you have in place. Can you talk a little bit about what is in that portfolio? Like, what are some of the titles that have done well, and maybe anything that you notice that you think people like?
We have a couple of our own games as well, which are 100% owned IP. So, we're developing Soul Chicks, which is our game that, is currently still in development, planned to release toward the end of this year. But then alongside that, as you mentioned, our thesis was, developing new games and developing new IPs. It's both challenging and it's risky. It's not easy to do, and a lot of those games take 3 to 4 plus years to develop to have a really strong proposition. So, what we've done at Catheon is identified a number of sort of Web2 properties with existing user bases. There's over of the games that we've signed up so far, and it's about 25 at the moment, and there's hundreds of additional discussions in place. There's over 50 million existing Web2 players across those gaming portfolios, and it's a really wide and broad sort of portfolio of games across RPG games, anime games, shooters, puzzle games, so it's a really large spread. And our theory here is that in taking games with existing fan bases that have had commercial success and have got existing fan bases, and then layering the benefits of Web3 gaming on top of that, in terms of sort of integrating token economies and thinking about NFTs and thinking about how we do truly still keep entertainment front and center, but layer some of these earn mechanics or Web3 mechanics into it, then we can start creating bridges, bringing players from Web2 into the Web3 ecosystem. Those couple of games you've mentioned are on Solana, but we are multi-chain. We're thinking about this across different chains based on the genre and based on what we think would be the best option for that game, based on what it is. There's large anime communities on Ethereum, for instance, and if we've got a sport game, we look at Flow because of NBA Hot Shots might be a good option. So we do think about, okay, well, what's the best chain, and then alongside that, we have a platform for discoverability. So, thinking about a single place to, see and find Web3 games, and then have that as a marketplace for primary and secondary NFT transactions and stuff like that as well. So it's still 9 months young, and I'm relatively new to it, so I can't take too much credit for the work that's already been done by the team. But, Will and the team have made incredible inroads in a really short amount of time, and there's an incredible future ahead that we're really excited about.
I want to ask a question about geography and about kind of preferences for different types of experiences, for different types of form factors, as well as monetization models that you've seen both in your prior career as well as what you see in the blockchain gaming space. So for example, the behavior patterns in Asia versus the West around, free-to-play games or mobile games, and not putting up with, but being familiar with the pay-to-win model, right? Playing for free, but then spending money within the game. And then, of course, the Axie experience, right? With Axie being very popular in the Philippines to a pretty kind of unnatural degree. Can you take that lens geographically and maybe talk about the different behaviors that people have and kind of what implication you see in terms of Web3 adoption as well?
There is differences, although you are seeing, in multiple fronts, you are seeing a lot of sort of global convergence of tastes and trends. But particularly a lot of the world's video game trends have been born out of Asia. And so, free to play, mobile, and even sort of mid-core mobile gaming and a lot of those things. And I think we're seeing the same thing with Web3. There's a greater resistance to blockchain gaming in sort of the more traditional Western and European markets than there is to Asia. Not that Asia's probably a little too, I'm being a little too specific. Even markets like LATAM as well, are similar. But that's where you're seeing a lot of the trends and a lot of the pickup. On the pay to win piece, I don't really think it is. There's a greater acceptance of it in Asia, but even in Asia, it's not really that accepted. A pure pay to win game will still be rejected like it would be in Western markets. So the monetization or of the different markets, you tend to find that, in Asia, it's a little bit stronger in terms of average revenue per player. There's high disposable income in some markets like Japan and Korea, for instance. So, they're more willing to kind of buy in-game items and things like that. But, it's not massively dissimilar around the world. I think on your Axie Infinity example, it's an interesting one. I don't think that was a sustainable business model. And I think, that play to earn business model that has the earn mechanic sitting right at the front, you could see what happened with Axie Infinity. It pushed up the price of the token, it pushed up the price of the NFTs, and that basically crowds out any new user acquisition that comes into the market. And that basically breaks a game. That creates an unsustainable economy because any successful game has a circular or a virtual cycle in the economy whereby as players churn out, ideally you are being able to bring new user acquisition in. And when you have, really high prices of entry that have been borne by inflationary pressure, then that's where the whole system breaks. What I find interesting about that model, though, because some people say, hey, well, the gameplay's, not that exciting. But, in some of the more emerging markets, you also have to keep in mind that, and I think this is a nuance that also existed in my old role, that the technology is not the same. People don't necessarily have high-spec computers or consoles or really high-spec phones. So the idea of there being a proposition in emerging markets that's actually slightly more simplified gameplay, but that actually works for those audiences and builds audiences of players that actually do enjoy that experience and then can get some benefit of monetizing from that experience. I think that's probably why you've seen those games be successful in those markets. Not everybody's got high-spec machines that can play high-spec games. And, so I think it'll be interesting to see the way the space evolves.
If all this stuff works, if we are in a world where there's lots of computational blockchains, where they're very performant and they can render the economic underpinnings of all these worlds and they can keep track of all the items and so on, assuming all that stuff works, which of course is a silly assumption to make without more caveats, but assuming that works, how do you see a player interact with games and virtual worlds? How do you see, NFT objects travel in or between these worlds? Like, what do you expect to happen to in-game items? Paint a picture of the possible here, if this comes to fruition, because I think it's more than, merely another monetization lever. Like, what happens to avatars and identities if this stuff comes together?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many ways that this could play out, but let me sort of hypothesize on it a little bit. I think the true interoperability, there's a long way to go. Like the idea that you can pick up acquire a sword and level it up in one game and then go and drop that down into another game and have it. I think the balancing that occurs within in-game economies and environments and maps is so delicate that that's going to be really tricky. Over time, it may end up being solved for, and it might be something that you see, between games of the one studio or games built on the same engine, or if they're all built on Unity, there might be a way to solve around it. But I think that part of it's really, really quite complex. But I think if you think about this in terms of, a couple of things, the game could, an item in a game, for instance, or earning in one game could perhaps create some type of benefit or level up in another game, even if it's not the same item exactly. There could be really strong collectability around the items in a game. I think I I forget where I read it, but I read, someone drew the analogy of, imagine if you could buy the NFT of the very weapon that your favorite esports athlete used to fire the shot in the Call of Duty World Championships to win the championship. And, they signed the weapon and you had that weapon as an NFT. That's got huge collectability and huge value that would be able to be used as an in-game item, but would also, regardless of what happened with Call of Duty, would have, it'd have utility outside that ecosystem as a true collectible item. And then I think what you'll see is, companies start to get really clever about how they even potentially merge the real world with the virtual world. If I draw an example of, say, hey, imagine Fortnite as a game, hugely popular, people love the cosmetics in the game and building their characters up and all that kind of stuff. Imagine it was in a sort of play to earn mechanic, and you had a sports brand, like Nike, for instance, that created a super limited edition pair of sneakers, but then had an NFT that went with those sneakers. And let's just say that NFT gave you the same pair of sneakers in Fortnite. And so you could wear those shoes in Fortnite. Over time, that digital pair of sneakers has probably got infinite more value than the actual physical pair do, but you'll start to see some really interesting, perhaps, collaborations happen between the real world and the virtual world. I think there's multiple ways under which you could see this play out, and I don't think any of us really have the answers to that yet, but I think it's super exciting. It's going to be fun to work it out and see how it evolves.
It's an absolutely fantastic space, and there's so many unanswered questions, which is, of course, what makes it interesting and promising. Mark, thank you so much for joining us today. If our audience wants to find out more about you, about Catheon, where should they go?
Yeah, I mean, CatheonGaming.com has everything that you could find about the company. Otherwise, you can look me up at LinkedIn. My Twitter's at Mark Aubs, Mark AUBZ. So yeah, happy to engage. But great to catch up, Lex. Thanks for taking the time.
My pleasure. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. That's it for this week's episode of the FinTech Blueprint. For more technical deep dives into all things fintech and decentralized finance, check out fintechblueprint.com and grab a free subscription to the newsletter. This is Lex, and I'll see you next time.